Greetings, I'm Vince Staley, Executive Director of Media Impact Funders, and I want to thank you for joining our final session of this year's Media Impact Forum. Our theme this year has been to focus on the critical importance of evidence-based communications in science, health, and the environment. In the wake of the devastating global pandemic, previous sessions have focused special attention on the role of communications in helping everyone understand the urgency and efficacy of the COVID vaccines. And so we've heard about the remarkable efforts supported by funders to promote confidence in and expand equitable access to these life-saving vaccines. Today, we're going to explore the ways that we depend upon the truthful expression of evidence-based communication in our civic life as well. Over the years, media funders have often claimed that a healthy democracy depends upon a strong and independent press. But in truth, this assertion may have come off as an abstract notion for those of us in the United States, where threats to press freedom were generally felt to be remote. But the past few years put an end to that complacency, as we heard from the former president a frequent refrain that journalists were the enemy of the people and purveyors of fake news. This attack on the press can be seen as the leading edge of a push toward authoritarianism and an attack on the fundamental institutions of our democracy. In today's program, we're going to address the rise of authoritarianism at home and abroad and what philanthropy can do to confront this dangerous political force. We're probably most concerned with defending our own civic institutions here in the United States, but authoritarianism has been on the rise around the world over the past few years, with strongmen expanding their power in Hungary, Turkey, Brazil, Russia, and many other countries. I'm not a historian, but more and more of us are becoming familiar with the essential elements of authoritarian movements. They attack core democratic institutions and especially work to undermine a free and independent press that can speak truth to power and hold rulers accountable. Another key feature is an attack upon pluralism and tolerance for diversity. The bulk of today's program will be devoted to questions related to the first concern: how do we support and strengthen a free press? And how do we encourage journalists to understand the existential threats to their freedoms? And for that discussion, we have a tremendous panel which will be moderated by Alafia Zoyab, Advocacy Director of Reset, which is an initiative that seeks to change how the internet enables the spread of news and information. But before I turn the program over to Alafia, we're going to hear from Thomas Allen Harris, creator and host of the PBS series Family Pictures USA, to help us appreciate the rich tapestry of American life. If authoritarian movements depend upon an assault on pluralism, a defense of our diverse democracy will uplift the contributions of all communities. And that's what Thomas has done in all of his work in documentary films, in photography, and in his classes at Yale, where he's a member of the faculty in African American Studies and Film and Media Studies, and where he teaches about family narratives and community storytelling, among other subjects. Thomas is currently on a plane and unable to join us at this moment, but I had a chance to speak with him earlier, and we're going to share that short conversation before we hear from the panel. Thomas Allen Harris, welcome to our discussion.
Hi, Vince. Thank you. Good to be here.
Hey, how are you?
Thank you. I'm doing well.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to have you back with us. Let me just ask you to reflect on these concerns. Are you worried about the rise of authoritarianism in the United States? And how do you see your own work in response to these dynamics?
I'm definitely worried about it. I mean, I see the pushback and the repeal of voting rights and rights, citizenship rights, disenfranchisement, and the rule of the minority, that's been discussed increasingly. I think that a lot of this is an old playbook, and a lot of it stems from segregation in this particular case in the United States, and the suppression of the stories around both how we're connected, but also the suppression of stories of diversity within our country and what made this country and built this country. And so whether we're talking about origin stories with regards to immigrants and how immigrants came and, contributed to the social fabric and economic success of the United States, contributed to building one another up. And that is something that is really important in Family Pictures USA. We created a storytelling platform that came out of 25 years of making personal films that Mine, My Family, an extended family album, to talk about and shed light on larger social movements. And so, it's really important. Part of our mission is to elevate those stories and remix the narratives to create a kind of new family album, a new way to see ourselves as in a collective rather than us versus them.
Yeah, and your approach seems very timely to the demands of this moment. Can you just remind us, if you can briefly, how you engage people to share their family stories? What's your methodology?
Well, my work lies at the intersection of film and photography. And so I've used the family album as a leitmotif in all of my feature films and also my TV series. And so we created a methodology where we allow people to come. It's a methodology and a platform where we allow people to come and share their family photographs with us. And they share the stories behind the family photographs. And so people are able to kind of remix their own narratives into a kind of larger public narrative. And it's also, the part of the platform is also a kind of listening to and observing and the testimonies of other people sharing their family photographs, and so in this age where there's such tremendous polarization and people cannot find common ground, this provides and is centering the commonality of the family, of our origin stories, of what's important to us, both in terms of the people that we're connected, the families that we come from, and the families that we're building. And so that is something which is definitely a sovereign kind of story that doesn't, my story can only allow for you to reflect on your story.
Right.
So that's the power of our platform.
That's great. And you've traveled widely across the country, have encountered every type of community. What are those commonalities that we can build upon? And conversely, what are the real divisions that enable this political mischief that we've been experiencing?
Well, I'll start with the latter part of that question. I think the mischief is rooted in ignorance, of one another, tribalism, and also the fear that engenders. I think that, as I mentioned earlier around segregation, we are not able to see one another wholly. And so we see so often through the lens of the stereotype and through the lens of a kind of, your advancement means a kind of a minus to me, is somehow a threat to my security, as opposed to thinking of ourselves as a society in which we have collectively built ourselves up. And so, to allow for people to understand the history of a particular group, whether that group is an ethnic group or that group is, a sexual minority, LGBT person, or a recent immigrant. These stories, from the perspective of family members, allow us an access and also help us to see the weave of the fabric through the family album.
That's great. And I think it's those commonalities that we can really build on to strengthen the e pluribus unum, the from many one, that is the quintessential American experience, right? So hearing from so many family stories from Indigenous communities, from every racial and ethnic group, etc., what are the broadest insights that you've drawn from your work that can inform our discussion today?
Well, with the TV series, we represent people from every aspect of society. We have seen that people who come together and are able to look at one another through the lens of the family album are transformed. And so I'm engaged, and Family Pictures USA is engaged in a transformative form of storytelling. So it is taking the idea of citizen journalism the next step, so that people can actually tell the stories of their communities, of their families, and have those be intermixed and shed light on other stories from other communities. And together, it provides a way for us to see America in a kind of new way. One of the things that we saw with taking Family Pictures to Detroit is 40% of the 100 people that came and shared their family albums with us had stories of women entrepreneurs. Who thinks of Detroit and thinks women entrepreneurs? But these types of suppressed stories, which kind of battle the kind of stereotype, allow for us also to battle misrepresentation and to elevate truth.
Maybe it's an opportunity to see ourselves completely for the first time.
Exactly. And also to see our interconnectedness. There is both a kind of connection that is biological in terms of families finding each other across race, across ethnicity, across class, and then also to see ourselves in other people. I think that is, the root of the difficulty that we're having right now, particularly in the United States. But I think that the idea that, in some ways, it has to do with the essence of storytelling, where you always have an antagonist. What if we had a storytelling methodology, which is what Family Pictures offers, in which we can kind of weave stories as opposed to define a devil, if you will, or an enemy, and have to really define ourselves in opposition to that entity.
And that is, of course, the instrument that authoritarians require to exert their power in countries and around the world and in throughout history. Well, thanks, Thomas. We're going to pause here and invite Alafia to lead our panel in discussion now. And then towards the end of the program, we'd like to circle back to you for final thoughts and opportunities to build upon your inspiring body of work. And so now I'd like to invite Alafia Zoya, Advocacy Director of Reset, to take over and lead the discussion with our illustrious panel of experts.
Thank you so much, Vince. It's great to be here to discuss a topic that's really close to my heart. As we think about how we build trustworthy media for a healthy democracy, we obviously have to take a really close look at the media, the watchdog industry that holds power to account. It's an industry that faces serious headwinds, indeed existential threats. So where we're going to begin today's discussion is to start, I'm going to invite Jay Rosen. He's the Associate Professor of Journalism at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute at NYU. And I'd like to invite you, Jay, to talk about the problem of authoritarianism, how it impacts on the media industry, indeed starting globally and then in the US.
Thank you, Alafia. I was asked to give an overview of the landscape for a free press, given the rising tide of authoritarianism and anti-democratic politics around the world. This is something that I write about and worry about a lot, so I'm very happy to be with you today. A good place to begin is with the shared picture of politics and media that prevailed for a very long time until its recent collapse. A kind of mental model that told us what to expect and demand from journalists. And by us, I mean not only people in journalism, but in politics and government, among activists, academics, and funders. All shared this basic picture, and it went like this. In the United States, we have a two-party system. The Democrats and the Republicans are roughly similar entities with different philosophies, different priorities, and different coalitions. Both have a moderate and more ideological wing that exist in tension with one another. And between the two parties sits the press, which is a creature of neither side. Rather, it controls access to the audience and thus shapes what people know of politics and their impression of politicians, and therefore it influences public opinion. In this model, the major worries are that the press remain independent, that it conduct itself as a profession with a code of ethics, and that it devote itself to the public interest rather than seeking only profit or power. Criticism could therefore focus on how well journalists and news companies did at remaining independent, obeying their professional code, and providing a public service. The criticism of political bias grew out of this basic picture I'm describing. It asked if journalists were being fair to both sides. Objectivity, and what I've called in my criticism the view from nowhere, also depend on this model of two parties similar in kind with different philosophies that compete for advantage and for power. It's important to add that in this picture I'm describing, had broad legitimacy and adoption in the public culture of the United States. Presidents clung to it as much as journalists did. Nixon, for example, hated the press and wanted to destroy what he thought of as his enemies in journalism, but he expressed that hatred in private. He never made a public campaign out of it because the press had too much legitimacy. One more thing about this standard image. It assumed a common world of fact and two parties that disagreed about what to do about those facts. Now contrast that mental model with the landscape we confront today. Today, in the United States, we have a two-party system, and one of the two is increasingly anti-democratic. A party leader with authoritarian tendencies is gone from power, but the Republican Party absorbed his methods and message and is now organized around them. We have a right-wing media ecosystem that is completely interwoven with Republican politics. It speaks to the party's base with far more force and effect than the public service press can. Increasingly, it is not the mainstream media, but the tech platforms that own the relationship with the news-consuming audience. As the traditional press declines in influence and reach, the platforms gain in power, and they do not have the same public service ethic or professionalism to appeal to. Being anti-media is not only common for Republican Party leaders and activists, rather it is basic to their political identity and helps hold the coalition together. I cannot stress this part enough. We are way beyond the world of criticism of bias and such tactics as working the refs. The conservative coalition is organized around the rejection of the reality the mainstream press still depicts in its daily coverage. A goal of the right-wing ecosystem is to, in a way, raise reality's negatives, the way you would try to raise the negatives of a candidate you oppose. And it's not just journalism. All the professions and institutions charged with serving as a reality check have come under attack during Trump and after Trump. It's been the intelligence community, the FBI, the diplomatic corps, scientists in government agencies like the EPA, public health officials, academics. Again, the authoritarian right wing organizes itself around the rejection of the real on multiple fronts. This is how we get the attack on Anthony Fauci's authority as a mobilizing device for Republicans. And this is how we get the incredible fact that Republicans, members of a pro-life party, are vastly more likely to refuse the vaccine. The situation is so extreme that it has exceeded our language for talking about it. And this is how we get such miserable terms as post-truth, which don't really make any sense, but are our desperate way to get a handle on what is happening. To sum it up, the mental model on which public service journalism was built has collapsed. This is why I have argued that the public service press has to become not more liberal, more left, or more friendly to the Democrats. That wouldn't help at all. But more aggressively pro-truth, pro-democracy, pro-voting and participation, pro-accountability for those who preach authoritarianism and rejection of the real. This is an enormous task. Finally, the place we have to start, and this includes funders, is in rebuilding an evidence-based politics and journalism at the local level. In local problem solving, there's still a chance for a common world of fact among people who stand on opposing sides of the national divide. For example, people who drive across a crumbling bridge every morning know that it has to be replaced in a way that is totally different from knowing about critical race theory because you heard Tucker Carlson talking about it. And so if we are to build a new model for how politics and media fit together and how journalists can serve us, it's probably going to begin in local politics with local problem solving and a press that can serve that end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jay. And since you mentioned local, I'm gonna go first to Crystal Haling. She's the executive director of the Libra Foundation, and they very much prioritize grant making at the grassroots level with frontline communities. Crystal, I'm curious about how your grantees and the communities at the frontline are experiencing this rise of authoritarianism, and whether the information deserts that are happening across the country and globally, how is that impacting communities? And does what Jay has said about going local and really fostering local journalism resonate with you?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you, Vince and all for having me. I really want to just start with one brief, slightly strange analogy. Not long ago, I read a book called The Unthinkable, Who Survives When Disaster Strikes? And it's a really interesting book and gets into brain science about who survives when natural disasters happen, or any kind of disaster, a plane crash or an earthquake. And one of the things that really stuck in my mind, one of the stories that she told, is that there are often a lot of survivors when a plane crashes, and that they are sitting in their seats with their seat belts on as the plane fills with smoke after the plane has hit the ground. And that the difference between people who survive and planes where there's a lot of survivors and there are fewer survivors is that somebody makes a move. They stand up and yell, "Get out." They take off their seatbelt, they do something, they clap their hands. And it reframes the brain around the fact that something horrible has happened, and a radical shift must happen. I think we're in that moment, and we desperately need the press to be the people who stand up and clap their hands and shout. We are watching a very progressive, clear, predictable slide towards authoritarianism. And what we have seen at our foundation is that in addition to needing the press to do that, the people who are actually doing that are the local community-based organizers. Our grantees are the folks who have been raising the alarm, jumping up and shouting, and saying something different must happen. We watched last year, after the murder of George Floyd, the largest single movement and protest in this country, in the recent history of this country, and some would argue in its entire history. Now, that was motivated not by hashtags, not just by social media, but actually by people on the ground, by organizers who knew their neighbors, who were calling out to people and saying, we've actually got to stand up for Black lives, and we've got to be on the front lines of really saving this democracy. Our foundation launched the Democracy Frontlines Fund, which was focused on funding Black-led organizers. And we funded a slate of 10 organizations that are doing that. Now, it's important to note that a lot of people said, why are you saying this is a Democracy Frontlines Fund? But let's recognize that the protesters who were standing up and fighting not only to say that what happened to George Floyd is inexcusable, but to make the linkage in the Black community that has always been there, which is that you have to first stop killing us for us to feel that we are part of this democracy. That the fact that there can be indiscriminate murder at the hands of the state suggests that we actually have to fight for this democracy. We funded organizations like Black Voters Matter, BYP 100, which are young people who are coming out and demanding different things in their communities, the Movement for Black Lives, the Southern Power Fund, the Black LGBTQ Project, Migrant Project, which is focusing on the fact that so many migrants are actually also Black people, that Black communities recognize that ICE is a police and detention facilities are prisons. And these are the things that we have to fight against when we talk about what's happening to destroy our democracy. So I did just want to say that when Jay really talked so beautifully and eloquently about the importance of being pro-truth, pro-democracy, pro-accountability, and going local, I would echo that. And I would also say that the media cannot just be local, but has to also recognize that people who are closest to the issues, those protesters, those activists, those organizers, those folks in the Black and Brown and Indigenous communities that have been on the short stick of democracy for a long time, need to also be the people reporting on what's happening in the community. They are trusted advisors. They are trusted voices in communities. So local is important, but it also has to be those voices that are coming from the community, that are trusted and have the ability to actually stand up in that plane wreck, shake our shoulders and say, this is not a drill. We really actually have to show up differently. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. I wanna go next to Sadia because I'm curious about, and I know that Sadia is the CEO of the Inspirit Foundation, and I know that you work on, one of the issues that you work on is the rise of Islamophobia. And I'm really curious about this interplay between the way certain communities are marginalized and stereotyped in mainstream media and how that plays out at the local level. Because on the one hand, what we've heard so far is that some of these local communities really can make a difference by being the ones that stand up and say, this isn't a fire drill. On the other hand, there is this interplay between the polarization that is in fact really happening at national and local level. So I'm curious about how you see that playing out, particularly on the communities that you work with. And I know that you wanted to say more about pluralism and media, so go ahead, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alafia. Boy, I'm going to start big. Thank you so much for your comments, Jay. And the mental model, really, really important. However, it was a mental model that never included many of us. And one of the biggest issues, certainly within the media ecosystem in Canada, is the implosion within legacy media of the questioning of all aspects of that mental model. And the mental model, in some weird way, this is actually an issue where the right is aligned in the sense that the questioning of reality, the questioning of realities by communities of color, the questioning of reality that is fed to us on a regular basis is something that is very real. I say this during a week, during a month actually, in the last month, just to give you a sense of the present media reality. There have been hundreds of graves of unmarked children that have been found in residential schools across this country. We have had a young white man charged with terrorism-related offenses for plowing down with his pickup truck a Muslim family out for a walk. Everybody died except for a 9-year-old boy. So in the midst of all this, the question becomes whose reality and whose sense of what media should be is actually, at the forefront of a lot of these discussions. So I'll leave that with you because that's huge, because it intersects with both of our priority areas. One, which is about combating Islamophobia, the only foundation in Canada actually to do so. And secondly, the other part of our mandate is really to look at fostering reconciliation with Indigenous communities. So both of these recent events fall squarely within the heart of what we do. And we do it ultimately with an aim towards a North Star, I would call it, around pluralism, which we define as the energetic engagement with diversity, but with a focus on a deep sense of belonging. And that's where the media ecosystem has failed us repeatedly. That deep sense of belonging in a community, in a democracy, where we should all feel like we have a place without there being a scarcity model, that our presence is a threat to somebody else. Our stories are a threat to somebody else. So in our work, we focused a lot on shifting narrative power. And I'll borrow a word from a phrase that I love from somebody who runs the Indigenous Screen Office here, Jesse Wente, who uses the word narrative sovereignty. And I love that word because there is a framing that happens there around who gets to decide how issues are framed and who gets to decide what's important and what's not. And that's the implosion that we're seeing within our legacy ecosystem here in Canada. In terms of our work, what we're funding is really a lot of independent publications, digital publishers who are outside of the legacy ecosystem. Because fundamentally, we don't believe that that ecosystem is going to change fast enough for all of these very, very urgent questions. And in reality, where we are is actually also killing some communities in terms of the narratives that are out there. In both Indigenous communities and within Muslim communities in Canada, there is a narrative. In the latter, particularly fed post 9/11, but with Indigenous communities since 1867, around who we are as peoples. And that narrative is literally, leading to people being killed. So this is urgent, and it is, it's urgent, but it's also it's systemic work, right? So we know it's also going to take time. And so I think where we struggle a lot is, while our ultimate mission is this notion of fostering pluralism and that sense of belonging, we also realize that there are communities right now who are just struggling to exist within our media ecosystems of all kinds, in their diversity, in their complexity, in everything that makes them who they are. And on the other hand, we have communities who are very comfortable in leaning in and having those discussions around difference. And so we're always kind of toggling between the two, right? Where do we step in, and what is most useful?
Sadia, thank you. I have a follow-up, but I'll come back to that later because I want to bring Jim Friedlich into the conversation now. He is the Executive Director and CEO of the Lenfest Institute for Journalism. Jim, my original question to you was going to be, what are some of the promising business models emerging on the horizon that can potentially rescue media? That was going to be my original question, but I mean, it's clear from what Sadia has said that it's not a dry issue around a business model. Journalism itself and the traditional newsroom has to fundamentally change. How are those two conversations around business models and how traditional journalism changes? How are they intersecting in the creation of a new media that can actually hold power to account and be truly representative?
It's a wonderful question. I really appreciate it. I wanted to start by thanking Vince and the Media Impact Funders for being such wonderful partners. We are both based in Philadelphia, where free speech in America is meant to have begun. And we really cherish the relationship and conversations like these. And it is humbling to follow Jay and Sadia and Crystal and all of their passion and sense of urgency about these issues. I think the business model question and the question of representation are joined at the hip, if not even more so. The business of public service journalism and journalism in general has shifted from an advertising-based mass eyeballs business to one of a much more representative and one-to-one relationship between newsmakers, newsrooms, and news consumers. That's a fancy way of saying that public service journalism is being and needs to be paid for by individual members. Jay and I work together on something called the Membership Puzzle Project, which is about that sense of affinity and that sense of belonging and representation that leads to people financially supporting media at the grassroots level. That's an emerging and an extraordinarily important public service business model. The digital subscription business model that has driven the work of for-profit media is actually thriving, and in some ways thriving on the heels of the Trump phenomena. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, where I came from, NPR, have all received very meaningful, direct increases in their membership, and in the case of the for-profits, their subscriptions. And of course, we're talking to fellow funders today about the growth of philanthropic funding for news and newspapers. The Pulitzer Prize this year, and I think it's wrong-headed to focus solely on Pulitzer Prizes, and that has been a problem for our industry. But the Pulitzer Prize this year for breaking news went to the Minneapolis Star-Tribune for its outstanding coverage by a highly diverse and large team of local journalists of the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, including the promulgation and spreading of the critical video that bore witness. The videographer herself, a 17-year-old woman of color, was also given a Pulitzer citation. So local news was at the center of that story as it promulgated globally, and that was recognized. I think representation really drives these business models. If readers are not engaged, if communities like Philadelphia, which is 45% Black, 15% Latinx, don't see themselves in the pages of or in the screens and feeds of publications like the Philadelphia Inquirer or NPR stations like WHYY, they won't support them. And each of those media are fighting quite hard to be more representative in their newsrooms, in their voices, and in their story selection. There's an array of things we have done as funders, which we can get to. But I think the very short answer to your question, Alafia, about business model and representation is yes, they are one and the same.
Thanks, Jim. Jay, I was going to ask you more questions about like the intersection of big tech here, but there's a great question in the chat, so we'll go to that first. And I invite the audience to continue posting their questions in the Q&A. But Jonathan Haywood, who's at the Public Interest News Foundation in the UK, his question is, do we need to let go of the ideal of journalism as the view from nowhere? And if so, what should replace this ideal? I think we've had some discussion of that, but keen to hear your thoughts. If we advocate journalism as the view from somewhere, example, journalism that represents the worldview of disenfranchised communities, then what distinguishes this from the view from somewhere of Fox or MSNBC? You're on mute, Jay. Yeah.
It's a very good question. Thank you. To some extent, the view from nowhere was a bad habit built on top of that mental model that I described. And I want to add that I said it was a consensus model. I didn't mean to say that it was without problems. It had many problems, but it kind of held the field for a long time. And now it doesn't anymore. And I think one of the reasons that the view from nowhere is so problematic is that it allows journalists to kind of wash their hands of all of the problems that we've just been talking about, in the view that if they are pro-democracy, if they are pro-accountability, that this will be a source of criticism and they'll be attacked for being biased. And they're, as a result, in a kind of a defensive crouch where anything they might do to change their routines is seen as too risky. And I think we're starting to get beyond that now, in part because of some of the problems that that we've been talking about here with Crystal and Sadia. If journalism is going to become more representative of communities that it has historically excluded, then the view from nowhere is in the way of doing that, because many journalists who've been hired to add perspective to legacy newsrooms because they come from underrepresented groups find a kind of paradox when they get there, which is that they are supposed to both represent their community and demonstrate to everybody that they are not playing favorites with their community. And so they're supposed to be a part of that community and they're supposed to be outside it at the same time. And it's a kind of confusing message. So I think in the long run, and it's going to take decades, it'll happen after I'm retired, but in the long run, a stronger system can emerge in which you combine 3 or 4 different elements. First, a view from somewhere, as you said, where instead of denying a point of view, you disclose it. There's a slogan that kind of reflects this view that transparency is the new objectivity. That idea that first we tell you where we're coming from can be one way of getting beyond the view from nowhere. But it has to be combined with a second thing that's equally important: very high standards of verification, standards of proof, evidence, which is part of what separates journalism from just politics or ideology or propaganda. So very high standards of verification combined with transparency. Transparency means we not only tell you what we know, we show you how we got there. So transparency is, don't believe me, look for yourself. Here's the study we relied upon. Here are the interviews we conducted. Here's the data. here's how we came to this conclusion. Here's why we decided to cover what we covered. That's all under the umbrella of transparency, and I think that's super important. And then finally, the fourth addition would be an openness to criticism and feedback, where you essentially say the story is not done until we find out from you, the community, what was left out of it. So if you put those things together, a view from somewhere, high standards of verification, commitment to transparency, and an openness to criticism, I think ultimately that's going to be a stronger system than the view from nowhere, but it's going to take a long time to get there.
Can I jump in on this? I would love to just share. I totally, I so appreciate the question, and thank you so much for it. And thanks, Jay. I agree with what you're saying. And just to put a finer point on that too, from my perspective, the mainstream media has always had a somewhere. It's just that the somewhere was white men who considered other white men to be the authority figures and neutral and objective, and everybody else is somewhere and biased and a perspective. And so I think what Jay said, I loved that, transparency is the new objectivity. I think there's a lot there. Mainstream media has really treated the news kind of like a ticker tape. Right? You just sort of read what's happening. And what that has meant is that it is, a ticker tape is two-dimensional, not three-dimensional, and it's ahistoric. Right? So what we're really saying is that you have to declare where you are. You actually have to understand the three-dimensionality of the real stories that are happening. And you actually have to also understand the history that goes behind it. There's a reason why critical race theory is being demonized, because it is about understanding the history that impacts the moment that we're in. And without understanding that history, you can always make it up. You can always say there's no real facts, there's no real truth. And that is where I think, it's really important. And there's another comment that just came in about recognizing the media that has always shown many of those different voices and raising that up. And I think that's, I really appreciate raising that point too. There's always been local media, Black press, Latinx press, Indigenous news, communications, newsletters, et cetera. Those are all things that need to be built upon, funded, grown, because they've always been there and they've always been telling the stories of these communities in ways that fully show the humanity, the three-dimensionality, and also build on the history.
Satya, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, no, I am just nodding as Crystal is speaking. I think this whole notion of the view from somewhere, nowhere, she summed it up so well. I will only say from my personal experience post 9/11 that just having a name and a skin color that was brown was perceived to, in some ways have a point of view. Whereas none of my other colleagues particularly were burdened with having a point of view from being white or male, or even white and female. So, it's a really fundamental question, and I think that we're still struggling with our lack of understanding around this, and we really have to get our head around that big, the whole media. The basis of our understanding of how media is done, how journalism is done, is so fundamentally at the heart of this question. And I feel like a lot of the funding that we prioritize actually goes to communities who have a very different model and who intuitively understand that their being Indigenous or Black or Muslim and Black, or the intersectionality of all of those, is inherently part of their worldview that leads to accuracy, and which is very different than, I would say the kind of dominant framing around what is perceived to be rigorous and accurate. I'll give you a very good example from the last 2 weeks alone, actually. One of the publications we fund, Indigenous, when the news of the mass graves of children kind of hit this country very, very hard, they actually did something very interesting, which was they required silence from their entire editorial team and all their journalists, because there was a sacred fire that had been lit and no one was to speak until the fire had gone out. And that was, in terms of protocols, that was the only way that they could actually deal with the gravity of what has just happened. People had said this was, people knew that these graves existed, but when they were finally found, there it was. Very different protocol. The rush to urgency, the rush to say something immediately, the rush that somebody else might say it before us. They said no, like stop. And a lot of Indigenous journalists in this country were silent. And it was very, very interesting because I'd never seen that happen before. And I thought there are many different ways of defining what is accurate and what is appropriate. And a lot of what they had to say and what they wrote about and spoke about was incredibly accurate, incredibly nuanced and complex, and coverage that I had not seen before. Just was a real lesson in how things can be done very differently. Without always resorting to kind of mainstream and legacy models of how to do journalism well. And I think, they're in line for a lot of big awards coming up as well, because it was just, they just put their foot down and said, we won't be re-traumatized by a legacy media system that uses our pain to sell something. We will be in charge of this story. We will speak on it once we have done the processing we need to do. And I thought, okay. So that was my only comment.
I wanted to, if I may, Alafia, share some quick funding that we were able to do during the recent presidential election, very high impact. And this speaks to Sadia's point about defining who tells stories and the broader issue of how we define media in general and how we define support philanthropically. There's a group called AI for the People, which is run by an extraordinary Black woman who's a data scientist as well as a journalist. And she approached the Knight Lenfest Fund, which is Lenfest Institute and the Knight Foundation, with the idea of essentially creating an early warning system and tracking system of disinformation and misinformation on Black Twitter. And she wanted to use Philadelphia as ground zero for that because it is the largest aggregation of Black voters in a very key swing state in a very key election. And what they detected very quickly through both anecdotal and data observations was the presence of a very well-organized campaign of disinformation targeted at Black voters, specifically on Twitter, called Vote Down Ballot. And Vote Down Ballot essentially said, if you're a Democrat, fine, vote for whoever you want, down ballot, but leave the presidential, abstain on the presidential election, because frankly, they're both the same. And it doesn't matter. The outcome for our community will be the same. And this had something like 600,000 retweets by the time they found it. And they adapted, somewhat analogous to what Sadia had said, a technique called strategic silence. And the strategic silence was a well-practiced technique of not engaging that specific message, not kind of wrestling with it on Twitter, only to cause more sharing and retweet by both sides, but a new campaign, which was Vote Down COVID. And the Vote Down COVID campaign talked about the candidates and their positions on vaccination, mask wearing, social distancing, and other truth-telling. And the campaign appears to have had a meaningful impact. It certainly had a meaningful impact from a Twitter audience perspective. The audience for Vote Down COVID in the end dwarfed the audience for Vote Down Ballot. And so the lesson there is severalfold. One is funders and traditional journalists tend not to want to fund, or I should say traditional journalism funders tend not to want to fund advocacy. We had a serious conversation about, is that okay? Don't we believe in objectivity? What Jay might call the view from nowhere. Second, we tend to support traditional media. We own the Philadelphia Inquirer, and we have supported the Philadelphia Tribune, which is the longest continually operated Black newspaper in America. We believe in it, we support it. But the notion that the discussion, the conversation, the stories being told, and the techniques of those stories were happening on an entirely different platform where we could be effective was relatively new to us. So that was a lesson on several fronts. Not quite about the view from nowhere, but I guess the view from Twitter.
There's in fact a question for you, Jim, in the Q&A, and this goes back to the business model, to some of the successful business models that you mentioned. So it says, how do you think about Jim's work on business models when it comes to media outlets led by and for POC communities, including Indigenous communities? Great to hear subscription and membership for NYT, WSJ, NPR, etc. has been a boost. But what about folks who may not have disposable income to subscribe? I'm going to abuse my privilege as the chair and tack on another question, which is there a role for government at all in any of this at a time of rising authoritarianism? And if there isn't, like, is this precisely the space for philanthropy to fill?
I'll start with the question of ability to pay, and I agree with remind me the person who asked the question.
Well, actually, it's anonymous.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I was going to refer to them by name, but Anonymous's question is a very good one. Typically, even the New York Times, which serves a very affluent audience, has only about 5% of its readership on any given day, of its unique visitors on any given day are paying subscribers. So what the industry has moved towards is a kind of freemium model where there's a certain amount above the outside of the pay sphere and a certain amount inside. I think we need to go further than that and look at ways in which access can be provided for free to different groups. We're exploring kind of site licenses and student licenses and licenses of the content for other groups and other media. And when we move to the solutions conversation shortly, I'll provide more detail, but we started something called Spotlight PA, which provides really two-fisted investigative news and accountability journalism at the state level from Harrisburg. And it's foundation supported quite widely across the state. And it provides this content for free to now 70 news partners. So that's a reach of maybe 30 million unique visitors across the state. So I think there are models that provide payment and support, but not necessarily a $200 a year Washington Post subscription. So I think that's a very, very good question. The issue of government support that Alafia referred to, there's, I think, good and bad approaches to this. The traditional journalism view is that keeping the government as far as possible from the direct support of specific stories, specific streams of coverage, the environmental coverage brought to you by, the state of New Jersey, kind of thing. It has worked with the BBC, it has worked with NPR, but this makes us nervous. There are an array of other approaches that provide tax incentives, that provide government support that cannot influence the journalism. For example, there's a proposal knocking around now that your gift, your subscription to local media or your subscription to any news product in general be tax deductible, whether it's for-profit or non-profit. A gift to NPR is currently tax deductible. Your subscription to the New York Times or the Philadelphia Inquirer or the Minneapolis Star Tribune, which does wonderful work, is not deductible. So there's a proposal by Rebuild Local News, which is advocating for government intervention and saving local news to that effect. There's also billions of dollars of government advertising that is placed in various media. And like most advertising, it's placed in big, easy to buy national media. So the census advertising, the military budgets, the get out the vote advertising, the COVID advertising, total tens of billions of dollars. And there's proposals to direct a certain amount of that, to mandate a certain amount of that to local media. That would be extremely advantageous. And it may sound like a pipe dream, but the city of New York recently changed its mandates around legal advertising and city budgets, which was on the order of $10 million of advertising, was redirected from big mainstream media to community media. And the Haitian media, the Chinese language media, Vietnamese media. And this is seen to have helped all of those media through the crisis of their COVID advertising loss. So there's a lot government can do. It's the nervousness is around directly influencing news content, but there are many ways around that.
Thanks, Jim. I wanted to come to a question that's in the chat. The next question is from Linda Miller. She asks, the media relevance sustainability conversation tends to center on mainstream media and its lack of diversity and declining trust. Why aren't we talking more about prioritizing investments in BIPOC local media, where there has always been a high level of community engagement, reciprocity, and trust? I think we're all sort of aligned on the latter. I think there seems to be consensus that that is true. Where I want to add on my questions is, one is, I'll start that question with Crystal. Is there, in your conversations with other foundations, is there emerging consensus that yes, that's a no-brainer on the one hand, and on the other, is there, are there emerging discussions around whether there's a whole strategy around watch the watchdogs that does what Jay mentioned, which is demands transparency of mainstream media, demands very high standards of verification, demands openness, so that they can actually become reform from within, essentially?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. Thank you, Althea. I'm not sure I can answer that. I can say, you know, I mentioned the Democracy Frontlines Fund, which we created, which 11 other funders, and I encourage you to take a look at the website. It's just democracyfrontlinesfund.org, joined in. And it really was an effort to move money to those frontlines organizations that are defending democracy. And I just do want to come back to that, because what Vince really started us out with was that powerful comment that we're not just trying to save media and press for the sake of it. We're trying to also talk about the importance of saving it in order to save our democracy. And so I really do think that that is incredibly important. And the local media and the press that is coming from Black and Indigenous and Latinx and Asian communities, all of those, it's really important because people see those stories and they see themselves. There was just recently a New York Times headline that said something like, you know, police arrest hundreds of protesters at Line 3 protest. Now, is the fact that the police were there and arresting people the lead and most important piece of the story, the fact that people are protesting this pipeline? The fact that over the last year and a half, the coverage of protests and marches and rallies has been it's been laughable at some level. I mean, it is treated as if it's a one-off event. It's treated as if it's a crime about to happen. It's been reported on largely using police as verified sources and organizers as questionable, activists in and accelerants to violence. There's now come out a report, that the NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund, and others are really trying to get people to talk about that. The vast majority of people during those protests were nonviolent. That the purpose of nonviolent protest is to show the violence of the state, right? It is to show, that is the purpose of nonviolence protest, right? So you can't hold the protesters accountable for there never being violence at a protest march. And yet that's the way things are framed. So I think it's really important to come back to this issue of there's a sense that the media, the mainstream media has always been neutral, when in fact what we've seen is that we're not actually getting the full story, right? And that's really what people are yearning for. And again, coming back to that, the far right is very good at speaking to people as if there are a we. And our media, the mainstream media, talks to people as if it's a they. The largely minority, BIPOC, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and other people of color media talks to the we. And that is very important because the emotion of feeling connected is the frame through which the human brain processes data, right? We don't just process data as facts that come in and say yes or no. We actually have to have an emotional frame to put them in. And that going back to the e pluribus unum, the we, is fundamentally essential to having a functioning press and having a functioning democracy.
Sadia, can I put that question to you next, which is that on the one hand, are there discussions rather amongst foundations that it's a no-brainer to be funding some of these local amazing initiatives led by BIPOC communities that are trusted, that tell their own stories? And on the other, is there a strategy around watching the watchdogs so that there can be reform from within?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. So a lot of our funding, when we in terms of our journalism funding, it goes to BIPOC led. We actually track by the number of initiatives that are actually led by Indigenous folks, Muslim folks, just because of our priority areas and those who serve those communities. So we're always prioritizing the leadership first, and when we can't do that, we're looking for essentially initiatives that serve those communities and do so, with an understanding of that collective we that Crystal is talking about. Watching the watchdog pieces is also so crucial, and I feel that just by their very existence, some of these publications are threatening. And they're threatening in the sense that they demand a different level of kind of engagement from our institutions. It's not the same game played in the same way, right? So, for example, the not using of police mugshots, right? That is actually information handed to you by a self-interested party, right? Is there a different way to do journalism that doesn't rely on those shots, right? That relies on other kinds of images and visuals. And so I think by their very nature, the fact that they exist, they hold power to account in their own small ways, and in some ways their own very big ways. And that is why I think they are so very threatening. So I don't know if that actually gets to your question, but I will also say something about the local piece, which is that the local piece is so important, so significant, especially during COVID, as you all know. The problem with engaging around the discussion on news deserts, which is a conversation that's as big here as it is in the US, as it is in the UK, is that trying to reinvigorate the news deserts doesn't actually get to the content that was never there in the first place. So when I'm thinking about that question, and when we're thinking about that question, is that we're looking at content deserts. What is the content that's missing? And going back from that, and it's a fundamentally different framing. It's a different paradigm, because we're not interested in replicating the small town paper that used to be there that never included all sorts of people. So what is the content that was missing, and where can we infuse some cash and some support into the missing content as opposed to the missing publication? And I guess, so when I'm a part of lots of discussions around philanthropy and media, or just media generally, the news desert question is fundamentally also flawed for me, because it's framing the issue as if we want to reinvent what was already there. None of us want to do that. So, and I think that having that question reframed as content deserts also allows us to hold power to account in a different way. Because if the framing is different, if different people are making editorial decisions, if different people are defining what accuracy is, if different folks with their very multitude of opinions and existences and their very presence in whatever community are kind of saying, hey, this is going on, I think that shakes things up in a way that's also threatening. And so I think about that a lot.
Thanks, Sadia. I have no idea where the hour has gone, because this has been such a riveting discussion, and we haven't even come to the issue of big tech. And as it turns out, in 3 minutes, I'm going to hand back to Vince. So what I'm going to request is closing comments, but like really 30 seconds bumper sticker style closing comments. This is an audience of funders. If there are 2 or 3 key takeaways for the way they should think about funding journalism that halts the rise of authoritarianism, what are the 2 or 3 key takeaways for them? Jay, I'll start with you.
It's very important to distinguish between subscription on the one hand and membership on the other. And very often these two things are conflated, but they're very different, especially important for the kind of discussion we've had here. Subscription is a product relationship. You pay your money, you get the product if you can afford it, if it's valuable enough to you. And we have a very good understanding of what a product relationship is. When we're no longer satisfied with the product, we stop using it. Membership is different. In membership, you join the cause because you believe in the importance of the work. And one of the implications of a membership model for the support of serious public service journalism is that it doesn't imply a paywall. People who join the cause because they believe it's important very often want the journalism product to spread to as many people as possible. They don't want people who can't pay to be excluded from the results. And so in the Membership Puzzle Project, which is a grant-funded program I worked on for 4 years, it's closing up in August, we tried to define what this membership model was and figure out how it worked in practice. Now, one of the things that we came upon was not everybody can afford to be a member. Not everyone can afford to contribute their money to the cause. But in that case, you can still have a membership model if you begin to value other kinds of contributions than cash to public service journalism. People can therefore donate their time. They can donate their knowledge of a particular community or social problem. They can donate their network so that the news company can communicate to everybody in that network.
Jay, I'm sorry to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt.
Anyway, that's the difference between the two.
Got it. 2 or 3 key takeaways for funders thinking about, I've got X amount of money, really want to support local, or I really want to support media that fosters democracy. 2 or 3 key takeaways, 30 seconds.
I think it is important to fund journalism produced by those excluded communities, as we have talked about. It's also important to fund the intellectual work of rebuilding the model of journalism that has now become so obsolete. And I think that can easily escape funders' notice. And I think it's important for us to fund experiments in which journalists and people outside of journalism collaborate together in rebuilding what public service news coverage looks like.
Thank you. Jim, to you next.
I'll sum it up by saying that what funders can do is do something simple and do something tangible. That doesn't necessarily mean do something low budget, but 3 quick examples. We have funded 2 very high impact content audits, each done by a group led by Andrea Wenzel at Temple University, one for WHYY and one for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And these look specifically at whose voices are being heard, who the sources are, who's writing what stories, what geographies are being covered, et cetera. Measure it to manage it. It's a very, very effective tool for management and for funders. The second is we funded something, and this was $10,000 only, with a group called NewsGuard. NewsGuard looks at fake news, disinformation, misinformation versus trustworthy news. And we looked at 160 sites. We funded something called the Pennsylvania Media Trust Report. We looked at 160 sites and found that 48 of them were funded by, quote, news sites were funded by the left and the right for political purposes, by PACs, by PR firms, et cetera. So shining a light on measuring the problem in your specific constituency, your geography. We're now funding a repeat of this in the state of California, funded by the McClatchy Foundation. So tremendously powerful and inexpensive approach. The last is we have a belief that nimble digital startups and entrepreneurship is extraordinarily important on the one hand, but the reach of Indigenous media, traditional media, NPR, et cetera, needs to be leveraged to combat disinformation and to make sure that democracy functions. So we started something called Spotlight PA, which I mentioned before. The budget is all of $1.5 million. There's 17 funders across the state, foundation funders, and several thousand individual members. And Jay, you can be a member through contribution or contribution in kind. This is now providing content to almost every newspaper, ethnic media, and NPR station in the state, all of it specifically investigative and accountability. It's a very, very powerful model and very inexpensive. So, and replicable.
Thank you. I'm going to stop you there and go to Crystal.
Well, I really want to thank everybody and build on everything that has been said. I think funding BIPOC communities, both activist organizers as well as the media, is incredibly important right now. And I think that we're going to find a way to sort ourselves out to a new equilibrium of comfort around what truth looks like and the voices that we have never been listening to that we now know we need to listen to. I think, oftentimes when we talk about funding Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other communities of color. I often hear funders talk about small in terms of the grant size, and I'd love to hear people talking about actually funding those organizations at scale. You know, we often say, well, let's start with the 10,000 or 20,000. And sometimes that's a great way to enter into a relationship. But also sometimes it's really important to put large dollars on the table to allow those organizations to actually grow, to scale, to plan, to build, to hire. Really important that I think that we do that. I think also I just want to follow in what Jim shared earlier and give a shout out to the example of the thing that I think we also have to do as funders. We have to have courage. We have to speak truth to power. And I want to just echo what Jim said in terms of recognizing Darnella Frazier, Pulitzer Prize winner, teenager who had the courage to take the video, the whole awful video that became the news that we all needed to see and to hear. We have to stand up, shake, rattle, make the noise. That's the courage we have to have. Move large money, move it in different ways than we're comfortable with, and we have to do it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. Indeed. Sadia, to you.
Yes, thank you. There is no fragile democracy in places where pluralism really, really thrives. And so if we go back to the intent of this conversation around democracy and the role of media in a democracy, if we have a healthy media ecosystem that allows for a multitude of voices, points of view, place-based reporting as well as reporting and work and investigative work that's coming from all sorts of different points of view, it's harder to crack that foundation around healthy, viable democracies. I would also just echo, we do a lot of multi-year funding and we do a lot of unrestricted funding. So we don't tell funders what they need to use the money on, and really, really important, especially for publications and media projects that are led by people of color and Indigenous communities who historically have been severely underfunded. So that's all I would say.
Thank you all so much for this amazing discussion. Okay. And I have certainly learned a lot. I will hand back to Vince, who will close us out. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alafia, as always, for your thoughtful moderation of the discussion today. I'm always in awe of the way you're able to weave disparate points of view together and make it really flow as a conversation. So thank you once again for that. And we'd like to end today's program where we began, hearing from Thomas Allen Harris, and more importantly, from some of the voices he has captured in his PBS program, Family Pictures USA. We'll view a short video clip that offers a glimpse of these quintessential American stories, and then I'll return with a few closing thoughts from Thomas as well. And so we'll go to those video clips now as well.
Immokalee has long been one of the poorest places in the nation. These images shocked the country in Edward R. Murrow's legendary 1960 documentary, Harvest of Shame.
They are the migrants, the underprotected, the undereducated.
Only on name they are not the slaves, but in the way they are treated, they are worse than slaves.
The harvest of shame. The best hope for the future of the migrants lies in the education of their children. But for the children of migrants, education is not easy to come by. And there is no case upon the record of the child of a migrant laborer ever receiving a college diploma. Ever receiving a college diploma.
Our family's originally from Zacatecas, Mexico. We migrated and to Immokalee when I was 5. And we've been living here since. Our father is the pillar of our family. His hard work ethic is what represents us as a family.
We chose this picture because this is where it all started. My mom and dad getting married. After this, they had us, and the story continues. I see us, I see our family background, my brothers, my sisters.
So these are a little bit of our origin when we made it to the United States. This is the first picture where my dad and my oldest brother, Felipe, decided that they wouldn't be working for anybody else. They will be working for themselves, and this is where their company started, which was the beginning of a lot of great things for us. We worked the fields as a big family.
We do a lot of the crops. We used to do tomatoes and a little bit of everything.
Once we worked for our own family, we were able to actually come back to school on time because my parents felt education was the only way. So instead of, following their footsteps, we needed to create our own.
I'm the first one to go to college. I went to the University of Florida, Gator fan.
We always challenged one another. He graduated number 5 in his four in his high school class. I was number 5, so I was down by 1.
Zuleika Quintero not only earned a college degree, she became a teacher and is now the principal of an elementary school. 90% of her students have parents who are farm workers. Zuleika uses her own photographs and story to inspire her students.
And this album is, again, really beautiful.
Very antique, okay? I'd like to start off with the picture of my dad. So this is my father when we worked in North Carolina. And if you notice, Ms. Quintero's up here, making boxes. Made a lot of boxes, okay? We did bell peppers, tomato, squash, zucchini. Give me a thumbs up if your families have done that before.
This is my grandpa working. He sends the produce to market. This is when I was little and they took me.
This is my mom when she celebrated her 15th birthday. And then the baby is one of her cousins. This one is a picture of me and my sister. My mom decided to take us a picture so we wouldn't forget about those moments.
And what was it like going through all the photographs to get the photographs to bring in today?
These pictures remind me of how whenever we were little, we would go through these pictures together and they would be like a journey.
These are our 6th graders, and I can't wait until these wonderful scholars end up graduating high school and then share with me which university they're going to be attending.
Role models like Zuleika inspire students to follow their dreams.
Well, thanks, Thomas, again for sharing these stories with us. I mean, wow, that is a very powerful clip. And I think it's so important to see these stories where, in contrast to the demonization of immigrants and poor people that we've seen so much of in recent years, this really tells the full story of their experience and the contributions they're making to our society. So thank you for sharing that with us. It's great to have your perspective in this important conversation today, and we'll share with our viewers links and materials about documentaries and television programs that you've done. But I also understand that you've been expanding your work, creating a platform where you share your methodology with nonprofits and community groups, working to bring people together and building community cohesion. Can you tell us about that aspect of your work too?
Yes, thank you, Vince. So after working in this on this project, Family Pictures USA, since 2009, we last couple of years we were approached by a variety of different philanthropic organizations and around working with them for narrative change. I think that you saw a little bit in the clip that when you talk about a photograph, you are both recounting a story that is something in the head, from your head, but it's also from the heart. So we're really talking to hearts and minds. And so we have been doing this project in 75 different cities across the United States, as well as Canada, Brazil, Ethiopia. And so we realized as we were making both the TV series, public artworks, working with a variety of different partners across the country and across the world, that we needed an institute. And so we created the Family Pictures Institute for Inclusive Storytelling. And what we're doing with the Institute is we're creating a kind of truth and reconciliation, an American version as opposed to the South African version, in which we're elevating the suppressed stories to empower communities to be able to see one another in ways that are non-confrontational, but also in ways that open the heart and allow us to see our commonalities and also ground the space in a kind of sacred yet secular space through live events, through social media, so that we can kind of trip up the idea of the demonization of the other.
Great. And who's supporting this expansion, and where will you be doing that work?
We're working with the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation and Darren Walker has come on board with catalytic support for the project. We're also working with several place-based foundations across the country. So the idea is that we would be have a center in at the Yale University, where I'm on faculty, and then have spokes of the project across the country.
Wonderful. So important for funders wherever they are to know that they have a way of dealing with this work in their own communities. We've been fortunate to be able to engage with you in some of these public programs, and I can tell you how much the room lights up when people are invited to share their stories with one another and with the whole group. It's really an inspiring experience for sure. So what more can be done?
Well, we're looking for partners to work with us, other storytelling venues, philanthropic organizations, various types of partners. We've worked with churches, we've worked with public housing authorities, we work with libraries, colleges, you name it. And so we're looking for partners to create and activate the country. You know, I think that it's really important to do the political work, but it's also really important to do this kind of cultural work, and in some ways healing work. You know, the suppression of certain stories, there is a certain violence to that. So I think that when you allow for stories to be elevated from particular groups, whether they have to do with class or race or gender or sexuality, and allow us to see our humanity reflected in a kind of community-based storytelling, then we have a way to begin to see and celebrate our commonality and open the heart a little bit, and in some ways become less me versus you, us versus them.
Wonderful. Well, this was a great addition to the rest of the panel's discussion earlier in the program. Thank you for making time to share this with us, and for your contribution to narrative change more broadly. So thanks for taking time here.
Thank you, Vince.
Take care. Great. Yeah, thanks to Thomas, wherever you are. And thanks to all of our speakers today, Jay, Jim, Crystal, and Sadia, for the bracing discussion we had, and Alafia for moderating it all. We saw these two big topics of defending democracy by defending journalism and defending pluralism, but it's clear from the discussion that you actually have to address the pluralism of journalism to be effective in this defense. I also just want to thank everyone who participated as a speaker or guest in all of our Media Impact Forum's programs this year from February till now. With any luck, we'll be able to return to our normal approach next year and get together in person for a day next spring. Thanks to the entire MIF team, board and staff combined, who all contributed to these programs over the past 5 months. And I want to finally thank all of our members for supporting these programs and everything we do at Media Impact Funders. We depend upon your support and we appreciate it. And so until next time, thanks and goodbye.